We kind of keep talking about like this being a women's issue, women's movement, right? And unfortunately, I don't think we're going to see the needle move until men really absorb and accept this as a men's issue and start addressing it with each other. And the interesting part for me around like the profile of someone who commits this is how offended males get when we're talking about this as an issue. And you'll start to see, the hashtags of not all men. My frustration in that is that in Alaska, when we have 60% of women are experiencing domestic violence or sexual assault in their lifetime, we can't talk about that and assume that 60% are being victimized by 3% of men. Like, statistically, that doesn't make sense, right? And so until we start to acknowledge that this is a widespread issue, we're not going to make an impact.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is Randi Breager, Executive Director of Abused Women's Aid in Crisis, or commonly known as AWAIC. AWAIC is the largest domestic violence safe shelter in Alaska, and it provides safe shelter and supportive services to everyone affected by domestic violence. If you or someone you know needs services, call the 24-hour crisis line at 907-272-0100. Randi was born here in Anchorage and has spent most of her life here. After earning a master's in public administration with a specialization in criminal justice, she worked at AWAIC for 5 years, but left in 2012 to take on many roles at the Department of Public Safety, including the statewide domestic violence and sexual assault coordinator. She then served as Senior Director of Programs at Anchorage's youth shelter, Covenant House. She has since returned to AWAIC, where she was named Executive Director in 2024. Randi Breager, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Tell us a little bit about your early life. Where did you grow up?
Well, I was born here, and then my family moved down to Texas, and then we moved back up here when I was 11 years old. The town we were in Texas was becoming too violent for my mom, and so she ended up moving us back up here, funny enough, to Mountain View, because back then you didn't have Wi-Fi and the ability to research what's going on in a community. So it was a little interesting for me.
So what year were you 11?
1995.
Okay, so you moved back to Alaska in 95.
Yeah.
Fifth grade?
Yep.
Yeah,
fifth grade.
Graduated from high school here?
Yeah, went to Bartlett, graduated from Bartlett, and then graduated from my undergrad here at UAA, and then got my master's at University of Nebraska.
And what did you get your master's in?
Public administration, specializing in criminology and criminal justice.
And what do you think got you started being interested in criminal justice?
My childhood, quite honestly. I think my story is not very different than a lot of kids, unfortunately, growing up. It's interesting because I used to say I had a ACE score of 9, but I did that because...
So ACE is...
Adverse childhood experiences, yes. And I purposely selected that number because then it allowed whatever was the worst thing in somebody else's mind to say, oh, well, she didn't experience that. But my ACE score is a 10. And it's not until I'm like in my 40s that I'm comfortable kind of embracing all of my experiences and understanding that I am who I am because of it and not necessarily in spite of it. Though I don't want kids to have to go through all of those things. Again, my story is not atypical, unfortunately. It's very, very common. I have worked with domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse victims for 20 years, and I hear my story told back to me over and over and over again.
Did you consciously know that you were going to pursue a career in that lane because of it? Or did you kind of realize one day, like, hey, I'm doing this because of what happened to me?
Good question. I think it's a little bit of both. So starting in elementary school, I was a peer helper. I was a peer mediator. Actually, our front desk person, Deanna, was my noon duty in elementary school. So don't ask her for any stories, but she'll tell you she's exactly the same as she was when she was in 5th grade. And then through high school, again, I did the Rarity program, which was reducing risks in teens and peer helping and peer mediation.
So I'm going to make some assumptions that that you were already processing the trauma as a child and were very informed. I mean, well, did you understand that you had experienced abuse and that it was not okay and you wanted to help other kids?
Oh, 100%. And I don't think that's necessarily how all children process it. That's just how I incorporated it into my life. And so, no, I was very aware of it. It was never explicitly told to me, but I remember several points throughout my childhood. I also knew my role was to protect my siblings because I didn't want us to be separated at some point. And it's never direct messaging, right? It's never don't call the cops or don't report it at school, right? It's just this thing that kids like me grow up knowing inherently. And so it was very much part of my personality. And funny, I actually started my career here many, 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 many years ago.
And by here, you mean AWAIC?
Here at AWAIC as a practicum student. And then when I graduated, I got pulled on full time and then ended up staying for 5.5 years, became the shelter manager before I moved on to Department of Public Safety. But I took my practicum here because at the time I wanted to go into law enforcement. And I thought that this would be great exposure and experience from a systems perspective to help prepare me later in my career. And it wasn't until I started working here that I realized law enforcement wasn't the direction I wanted to go in. I was more passionate about social work. And though I have immense respect for law enforcement, the roles are very different. And interacting with law enforcement and interacting with victims on their cases when I worked here the first time and seeing how limited the criminal justice system was and what they can do to support people, I knew that that would wear on me very quickly.
Did you ever experience time in shelter as a child?
I did not. No, we were fortunate enough to always have family. And so I was one of those classic kids where we went through periods where we would couch surf and then get reestablished. And I have so much more understanding and respect for my mom. We've talked a lot about it as I got older. And she is a prime example, and I say this with respect and admiration, she is a prime example of what a lot of women in her generation went through, where the choice was absolutely homelessness with 4 children or to stay. And so she chose to stay because she felt like that was the only way that she could provide
So she
for us.
stayed in an abusive relationship because it was better for the kids.
Yeah. That's her viewpoint, right? And obviously we know now through a lot of research that the impact for kids being exposed to domestic violence, even if they themselves are not abused directly, has immense lifelong impacts. But we also have many, many moms that are still in the position today where they have to choose to be hurt or to remove that security from their children.
I mean, your mom, you must have talked about it with your mom since you work here now. If she had known about something like AWAIC, if she'd known about a way to not be homeless and escape the violence, do you think she would have taken advantage of it?
Maybe. Again, I think generationally it was very different. Whereas there was no direct messaging about keep these things secret, there were a lot of cultural messaging in my family around issues that are private and at home stay within the home, right? And so, I'm in my 40s, she's in her 60s. And that's one thing that's super exciting to see nowadays is the culture is starting to shift around that. There's a lot less shame and blame attached to those things. And so I would say if she was presented that now, she might feel very different. But back then, I'm not sure she would have been able to overcome her cultural upbringing.
Did moving from Texas to Alaska, did that end the cycle of abuse, or Did it change things? Were you safer here?
No, it exacerbated it quite a bit. And that's also kind of what we see in domestic violence is when domestic violence already exists and then you add additional life stressors, it tends to exacerbate. And so when we moved here, things were significantly more expensive. We were significantly more isolated, both geographically, weather-wise, and all of those things. And so it definitely did not become safer for her.
You talked earlier about not wanting to go in law enforcement, wanting to follow more the social worker route, but you did work for DPS, for the Department of Public Safety, with troopers in the law enforcement realm. So I guess tell us a little bit about your journey from doing your practicum here at AWAIC to working for the state in law enforcement.
Yeah. So after spending 5 years here and kind of seeing the full breadth of experiences that victims had gone through, I really started looking at what can I do next to make an impact. You know, here, and I appreciate the work we do immensely, but here it is person to person and it's about helping each individual. And after a number of years, you start to feel like you're in this cycle of, okay, now what? How do we prevent this from happening? And so when the opportunity came up, and my first position within DPS was with the Alaska State Troopers as their statewide domestic violence and sexual assault coordinator, I got really excited about that prospect because it was a policy and training position. And so I thought I could apply the things I learned and saw here to help law enforcement better understand the dynamics they were walking into the middle of, which are very messy, right? And so I got to participate in, crafting their response policies for domestic violence and sexual assault. I did case reviews and consultations with troopers, did ride-alongs to try to understand from their perspective. I taught their police academy down in Sitka. And so I felt like that was my next step to not just have an impact for 1 or 10 or 100 that I was working with. I was hoping to have an impact statewide.
I Googled you in preparation for this interview.
Which is terrifying.
And what came up at the top was you teaching a strangulation course on the North Slope.
Yeah.
Can you talk about teaching that course and what that course involved?
Yeah. So one of my strategies with DPS was doing regionalized training and bringing it out to local law enforcement. We always did a lot of training within the troopers, but as you can imagine, we have 50 law enforcement agencies around the state with varying degrees of training and access. So what we were seeing was a big split between cases that troopers investigated or even the Anchorage Police Department and what some of the smaller departments were investigating. And so that strangulation course, and then I did a similar one with sexual assault and sexual assault response, and then also child first forensic interviewing, where we took the courses regionally. Strangulation in particular was one issue that we were seeing come up over and over and over again, and it's one of the hardest cases to prosecute. I would say strangulation and sexual assaults, very difficult to prosecute. And so we put together a specialized 2-day course just focused on investigating those specific types of assaults, and then also included preparation for law enforcement to be able to testify. Basically, it's like a hybrid expert witness. So they could answer questions that they weren't typically prepared to answer in court about those types of investigations.
Why is strangulation hard to prosecute?
Oh, thank you for asking that. It's like I planted you. Strangulation is a key lethality indicator. So what that tells us when we do something called a lethality assessment with victims, which is what we do here at AWAIC, strangulation is one of the things that indicate to us that this relationship is escalating in violence, and a lethality assessment doesn't assess what the likelihood of reassault is. It assesses the likelihood that you're going to be murdered by your partner, and strangulation is one of the key indicators. The issue then, on the other hand, is it also leaves very, very little physical evidence. And so even in homicide cases where someone was strangled to death, the outward appearance of the body has no physical injury. It is not until autopsy, where they evaluate the brain, that they can see particular petechiae, where the pressure built up so much within their bodies that their blood vessels were exploding, that they can rule that it was a strangulation homicide. And so that's really important for law enforcement, because everything in between can lead to serious physical injury and result in no outward marks on a body.
The New Yorker just had a very large profile on Andrew and Tristan Tate, the Tate brothers.
Yep.
And they were strangling women. One of the things that was showing up in women who came forward is that they all had complained of the same burst blood vessels in their eyes, the petechiae. And so I guess if law enforcement knows what to look for, they can see physical evidence.
In some types of strangulation, and that's what we could do a whole discussion just on strangulation, only in certain types. And so if you occlude the certain types of blood vessels, then it causes pressure. And so basically, if you're cutting off the flow that is trying to leave the brain, that is where it causes petechiae. But interestingly enough, that is not the blood vessels that take a higher level of pressure. And so if you're actually cutting off the carotid arteries, it takes more pounds of pressure, and you will not result in petechiae if the other blood vessels are not occluded.
But you would cause loss of consciousness.
Yes. And so that is one of the things that we would train law enforcement to ask questions about, is symptoms around loss of consciousness, because not everybody can recognize that they lost consciousness. And so asking them to describe their experiences, the classic, did your hearing start to go away? Did you start to get tunnel vision, see stars? A lot of people don't understand that their bodies actually lost consciousness, because one of the myths is once you lose consciousness, you're passed out. And when you have to get roused, right, you need smelling salts. When the reality is if you passed out and pressure is released, then you regain consciousness.
I don't know where it fits into your story, but you also worked at Covenant House. When does Covenant House fit into your story?
So after I left Department of Public Safety, I knew I wanted to get back into nonprofit work. I loved Department of Public Safety. I don't think I could have worked for another state agency, quite honestly.
And what years were you at Department of Public Safety?
2012 through 29 years. What is that?
2021?
Yeah.
2020? Yeah.
Yep. Thanks. I worked there for almost a decade, and then I went to Covenant House afterwards. And when that opportunity presented itself, after I spent my year in a politically appointed position up in public safety, we'll just leave that there. I knew I wanted to get back into nonprofit. I felt that even after all of the work I did with public safety, which I was immensely proud of, some of the projects I got to work on with CODIS reform and sexual assault kit reform.
What's CODIS reform?
So we were doing a lot of work with CODIS hit outcome tracking.
What are CODIS hit outcome tracking?
So whenever a crime occurs, if DNA is left either on the scene or on someone's body, you collect DNA and you can enter that into a database. And so when you are not sure who the perpetrator of that crime is, you can compare that DNA in the database against other known perpetrators' DNA. So when someone is arrested for certain types of crimes and or convicted in Alaska, their DNA sample is collected and entered into this database. Because what we find is most people who commit certain levels of crime, like sexual assault, child sexual abuse, and homicide, tend to have more than one victim. And so we collect that DNA, it gets entered, and then if a match occurs, then we can answer the whodunit question that sometimes we don't have the information on. And so for the CODIS hit reform projects, what we were finding is a lot of law enforcement lacked the manpower to then follow up on those CODIS hits. And so the crime lab would receive a hit, say, hey, you have a possible match. You need to now take these extra investigative steps to confirm, make sure that, this isn't helping you solve your case. But a lot of those CODIS hits were going unanswered. And that is partially because we have a high turnover in law enforcement, so that notification is going to someone who
doesn't know anything about that case.
Yeah. They moved to the lower 48, and what have you. And so what we found is a number of...
Actually, I just have to correct myself.
Yep.
So I said going to somebody who knows nothing about the case, but actually it was going to the officer who no longer works here.
Yep.
And so that guy in Oregon or whatever is like, no, don't work there no more.
Yep. Or they didn't get the email, right?
Oh, because the email address would have been for here, and there's no one answering that email.
Yep. And the departments that then also have like a central notification email, again, if they're getting a whole bunch in and they're seeing something from 10 years ago, they're
just moving on.
They're moving on. But what we found, I did a deep dive review on a number of very high profile cases in Alaska. And what I found was each one of those cases, I could trace back an earlier notification to those agencies that this person, who then went on to commit 3, 4, 5 more egregious assaults or homicides,
could have been stopped years ago.
Exactly. And so it was projects like those that I know made an incredible impact, but also I missed the getting to sit down and look at somebody in the face and know what I was doing right then was helping somebody. That and bureaucracy. The reality is nonprofits are more effective and efficient at a lot of things because we're not government. And that's the reality.
So having been on both sides, working in victim advocacy in nonprofit work and with law enforcement, in this case that you're just talking about being able to stop perpetrators years before they commit more egregious assaults, that's essential work. Like when you were talking earlier about wanting to prevent these sorts of things from happening, I feel like there's a really important role for someone like you in law enforcement, basically sort of guiding where the emphasis should be.
I would agree. I think that we are seeing trends across the country where law enforcement is becoming more research and data driven. And I think that over the years, you're going to kind of continue to see shifts in that. But the reality is even if you do data-driven kind of enforcement, there's always going to be a community aspect and expectation. We see this going on in our community right now, right? Where Anchorage police, and I do not represent them, not speaking for them. This is as a citizen, where they are trying to divert and focus their resources in certain ways. But then the community doesn't necessarily line up with that being their priority. And they want those resources shifted back to something else. Whether it is we are focusing really heavily on felony level assaults and drug dealing. So we are no longer going to focus on breaking up homeless camps and drug users, right? There's a strong visibility in those crimes where the community gets very upset. And law enforcement is saying, well, if we put our focus over here, there could be long-lasting positive impacts for the community. So there's always going to be that push and pull.
Well, I'm going to dive in a little bit here. I had Chief Sean Case on the podcast about 8 or 9 months ago, and he talked about how 95% of law enforcement is really connecting folks without resources with resources, that there's an incredibly heavy social work aspect to law enforcement that is sometimes lost on the applicant, the person who's applying to be a police officer, who thinks they're going to be doing high-speed car chases, breaking down doors and catching bad guys. And it turns out that they're checking to see if that drunk person on the sidewalk is
breathing,
alive. Exactly. That needs medical attention or just needs to go somewhere and sleep this off. And that the disconnect between the folks who become police officers and their expectations and what the work actually is quite large. And that impacts many aspects of law enforcement. We need to do a better job of explaining to folks what the job is and actually changing the way we recruit for the job, because There are folks out there who are really good at high-speed car chases and breaking down doors. But we need a lot of folks who are good at talking to people in need and helping people in need. And that sometimes those aren't the same person.
And you actually will see that the recruitment strategies in a number of law enforcement agencies across the country are shifting to kind of adjust for that. It's kind of that like type A, type B, or all those other personality enneagrams, right? Is what we historically felt would make the strongest police officer are not necessarily successful in today's modern policing. So full disclosure, my husband's a police officer. And so we get in a lot of these philosophical discussions, especially now that I'm kind of back on the advocacy side. We have a lot of like his perspective, my perspective, and, he's on the streets every day and dealing with those exact things that Chief Case is talking about.
What's the typical profile for a person who's committing domestic violence?
That's a great question because there isn't a typical profile in terms of race, socioeconomic status, profession, those types of things. It really does cross all of those different boundaries. Where you find the similarities, right, is in how people were raised and the messaging that they were given in terms of them determining what level of power and control they're entitled to over another person. And so lots of research is like, what causes this, right? And the reality is it's complicated. There are so many different factors, but the common thread, right, is that it is a learned behavior, whether explicitly or implicitly. And I have seen people from all walks of life. The interesting part for me around like the profile of someone who commits this is how I'm gonna tread lightly, right? Is how offended males get when we're talking about this as an issue, and you'll start to see the hashtags of not all men. My frustration in that is that in Alaska, when we have 60% of women are experiencing domestic violence or sexual assault in their lifetime, we can't talk about that and assume that 60% are being victimized by 3% of men. Like statistically, that doesn't make sense, right? And so until we start to acknowledge that this is a widespread issue based on a number of sociological factors, and we together as a society and a community start making shifts within our culture around it, we're not going to make an impact on the issue. And that's the reality. We kind of keep talking about like this being a women's issue, women's movement, right? And unfortunately, I don't think we're going to see the needle move until men really absorb and accept this as a men's issue and start addressing it with each other.
Bouncing back to that profile of Andrew Tate and Tristan Tate, I didn't know a lot about their story, but they were doing these online trainings that would have like 1.7 million men log in to learn how to basically groom women. And it's just like 1.7 million people logging on to like, and I'll give an example. Like he would say, step one is that you meet a woman, you go out with her a few times, you tell her how much you love her, you sort of like say that she's the only one, et cetera, et cetera. You have sex with her, and the next morning you treat her like crap and then order her to go make you a cup of coffee. And if she doesn't, she's graduated to the next step. Because if she says, hell no, I'm out of here, she's not the right psychological makeup to be victimized. And so if you treat her like crap and say that go make me a cup of coffee and she does, well, then you have a potential person to be groomed for the next step. Here is a short excerpt of Andrew Tate appearing on a podcast a couple of years ago.
Here's what you learn. A good woman will then up her game and try harder to keep you because she doesn't want to just go sleep with some other guy because she slept with a guy. It's a big deal for her. She has a pure heart. She'll try for you. If you cut your attention down on a bitch and she just goes, well, fuck it, I'll go fuck someone else. Or I'll just go on a boat in Miami, next party, or she stops replying, then
She did you a
ain't
favor.
worth shit.
She did you a favor
so,
too. Then
Yeah. So
But
the easiest way to tell if a girl's good or not is after the first time you sleep with her to see her involvement in the relationship post that day. Most men never do this test on a bitch. They never do it.
Mm-hmm. And that fits, unfortunately, exactly what we see in kind of our cycles of violence, right? What we kind of talk to the public about is if you went on a first date and he punched you in the face, there's not going to be a second date, right? There's this grooming aspect in the beginning that starts very subtly, where you're starting to remove people's choices and you're starting to isolate them from other people that can call this out, right? And over time, through that gaslighting, I call it the crazy making, you will start to see women take on that blame, shame onto themselves. And it keeps them, into those relationships. The other aspect is kind of the love bombing aspect and the quick movement through milestones in a relationship. We will often see as a red flag, not every case, but as a red flag, people who are pushing for quick milestones within a relationship, like moving in together, having a baby together, all of those things that creating that connection that goes beyond just that emotional piece, that financial reliance, that family tie. We see that as a way to then hook on to somebody and remove more of their choices later. And so it doesn't surprise me that the Tate brothers can explain the exact cycle of violence that we see every day and that it resonates with people.
I am thinking about red flags and Virginia Giuffre's book, Nobody's Girl. I had her ghostwriter, Amy Wallace, on the podcast a couple of months ago. And in that book, Virginia Giuffre is in Thailand, paid for by Jeffrey Epstein, doing massage therapy course. And she meets a man who's like a mixed martial arts fighter, and they're engaged 1 week later. And she talks about him rescuing her, but after her death by suicide, we learned that he was abusive throughout their marriage. When you know that and you're reading the book and you're like, you're engaged in after 1 week, that's an enormous red flag.
Or it's incredibly romantic, Andrew, because that's what society has raised us to believe. A book that you might find interesting is The Gift of Fear by Gavin de Becker. It's now decades old and it still holds so true, where it's the opposite side of the reason why all of this is effective, right? The grooming is only effective because on the other end, women are being groomed from the time that they are children, raised in a society of expectations of what their behavior should look like. And obviously, I'm making broad generalizations, right? When I say men, women, and behaviors. But what I boil it back down to is what the statistics show us. It's funny because your podcast was like the East Anchorage Book Club, and I'm like, ooh, we're going to talk about books.
God, we do talk about books. We always recommend books. So we're recommending Gavin de Becker's book called
Gift of Fear.
Gift of Fear.
Yeah. But in one of my favorite books that has nothing to do with domestic violence, this shows you how mainstream it is in society. One of the characters is talking about one of the leading causes of death in men being heart disease. And he goes, do you know what the leading cause of death for women is? And the female character says, men, because all women know that. And so that just shows you that regardless, again, this is cross sector, this is cross everything.
Can you
Women
spell that
know
out, by the way? Can you spell that out? Like how the leading cause of death for women is men?
I think it's a little bit of generalization, right? But if you read through the study by the Violence Policy Center, they do a review on women killed by men annually, which Alaska generally ranks number one. And just showing that whether it is direct homicide or trauma-related illnesses, including heart disease that they can now attribute to trauma and adverse childhood experiences, that the generalization is between all of those causes, men are at the root of it for a lot of women. And again, that is very oversimplifying it. I don't want to get tons of comments from males feeling like,
that they're being victimized by this podcast.
Yes. But again, we have to be able to talk about these issues to make any headway on it.
I'm very grateful to you because the reason why I know about your work at Covenant House is because you testified in support of raising the age of consent from 16 to 18, which we thankfully did by some miracle. The age of consent in Alaska is 18, and you were key testimony about what you observed at Covenant House. I guess, can you talk a little bit about what you saw in terms of 16 and 17-year-old girls with their boyfriends, quote unquote boyfriends?
Yeah. No, it was the grooming we talked about, right? And so what we were seeing repeatedly is our young teens, and I mean, that's like, they're children, however we want to paint it, right? They're children being picked up by middle-aged and older men. And when we would do a safety check and try to talk to the teen after they get dropped back off, we'd, ask questions from curiosity of like, who is this person? And are you safe? And things like that. And the answer was always overwhelmingly, oh, that's my boyfriend. And part of my testimony was not only from what I saw, but just purely common sense in that there is no situation you can convince me of where a 40 or 50-year-old man feels like he can have an equal relationship with a 17-year-old child. We're like, however we try to paint it, right? And you saw in the pushback you were experiencing, and I was experiencing too, as I'm putting myself publicly out there talking about this bill, where predominantly men want to explain all of the reasons and ways where it could be legitimate. And the only thing that made me do is sit back and realize there's still a lot more work to do around the culture of our society.
I will just say it wasn't just men.
Oh,
there were women who said it on the record. If my 16-year-old daughter's boyfriend is a 22-year-old and a senior in college, do you mean to tell me that they can't have sex with each other? And ultimately, as that bill moved through, we created a 6-year close-in age exemption. So actually, in certain circumstances, that senior in college could be dating a junior in high school and it would be okay.
No, it brings up a lot of complicated dynamics. And you're absolutely right. There were women that talked about that. And that's where the focus really kept getting shifted to is those close in age situations. And that's one of the things when I worked for Department of Public Safety, we actually did the research because this has been brought up for a decade. Like you managed to get something across the finish line that people have been working on for years. And
I mean, I will tell you, I was carrying the legislation at the right time in the public zeitgeist.
Yes.
I owe a lot to the victims of Jeffrey Epstein for speaking out and for making this a national issue. And they created an environment where folks being absolutely opposed to this legislative change was going to look terrible for them.
Yeah.
That's literally, there were people who were adamant that we would never do this, but they could see the writing on the wall that they were not allowed to say that out loud.
It became socially unacceptable, right? But that's how culture changes, right? Yeah, but no, I agree with you. I can't see very many circumstances where those situations are between equal peers. But the other piece, again, I try to get back to a practical, logical component with people when things are very emotional, right? And this was a very emotional issue. But what we saw in the data through Department of Public Safety, Department of Law, and court convictions is those cases that the parents were bringing up that my 16-year-old, is going to result in a 22-year-old losing their life, right? They're going to be in prison for life. It's like, that didn't happen, right? We knew we could count on two hands the number of cases that moved forward through conviction where it was those kind of close in age, Romeo and Juliet, quote unquote. Like you could dive into every one of those cases. Every single one of those cases, there were actually allegations of other crimes, including forced sexual assault, that because they couldn't convict on it, they then relied on lesser degrees of sexual assault. And so the data did not support the emotional fear and concern that we were going to be ruining young boys' lives.
I think there's an analogy being made when we talk about 60% of women in Alaska experiencing sexual assault or domestic violence at some point in their lives. And the predominant response from some folks online is this: not all men. We're talking about a very small percentage of men. This is really not about men. It's sort of a similar thing. When we're talking about why we're raising the age of consent, we are absolutely not talking about healthy, consensual relationships among peers. And is it possible that a 22-year-old and a 16-year-old could have a healthy, consensual relationship? Yes. And what I would say is, like, don't have sex in front of law enforcement. Tell your parents not to call the police. But do I want that 16-year-old female to have the power to call law enforcement and be taken seriously? Absolutely. Because that's what we didn't have before.
No, it was completely legal. Everything I was seeing at Covenant House was completely legal. And those preying on 16 and 17-year-olds, because that's what it was grooming and preying, knew it wasn't illegal. And they knew there was no recourse. And our state, we have single-digit conviction rates of sexual assault. So even if it became a forcible rape situation, to simplify it, right? The likelihood of them facing consequences for that type of assault are negligible. And that's what I don't think people realize, is when you track the attrition of knowing that only a small percentage of sexual assaults get reported, period. Small percentage of domestic violence, right? And then you go from investigation to prosecution to conviction, the attrition is down to 3%.
It has to be an egregious, crazy case.
Yeah. The odds are in your favor. The odds are in the favor of people who commit these crimes.
I had Ingrid Johnson, who is a professor at UAF. She's a specialist in gender-based violence. And what she said on the podcast that really stuck out to me was that legislators often will look at the domestic violence statistics and say, well, we need to do something. And she said the typical response is, what we're going to do is increase the prison sentence. We'll increase the penalty. But she said that is not moving the needle, because what would move the needle is the certainty of consequences. And right now in Alaska, there is no certainty of consequences, which is basically giving the green light to folks who commit domestic violence to continue committing domestic violence, because they know that the chances of them facing any consequences whatsoever is extraordinarily small. And I guess my question for you is, how do we increase the likelihood of certainty of consequences?
Oh, that is a big one that I don't even think I can answer, because I do think it is going to be so contingent upon societal and public will, right? If you can get past the investigation, which already has its own barriers, because there's going to be, and I don't say this with any negativity, there is going to be inherent skepticism and bias, because that is the role of law enforcement to an extent, right? If you can get past that point and pass a prosecutor's review of the case, you are then, best case scenario, putting a case in front of 12 jurors. And the cross-section of societal beliefs of 12 jurors is generally not going to support a strong conviction. And that's just where we are still at societally.
I want to talk about that because I think it's super important. You probably know the stats better than I do, but the percentage of 911 calls and law enforcement visits to homes, even in Anchorage, that are domestic violence related calls, I believe is high.
Very high.
So when you're talking about the single-digit percentage of folks being convicted.
Well, convicted of sexual assault.
Convicted of sexual assault. Okay, well, what about convicted of domestic violence?
I actually don't have APD's stats on that. Domestic violence ends up at a higher percentage, I believe, and I might be incorrect. It's in the 30 to 40% range. But the key piece that is different between domestic violence and sexual assault is the majority of all domestic violence convictions are misdemeanors. And then overwhelmingly, it results in 0 time served. So what we are asking victims to do is put their life at risk, because what we know through research is that post-separation period has the highest likelihood of them being murdered. We are asking them to put their life at risk for ultimately maybe a misdemeanor conviction where the person does not spend any time in jail other than that initial arrest, their time served, right? Or maybe 15 days or 30 days.
So what I'm hearing is that there actually might be some value in increasing the penalty for domestic violence.
Will that make an ultimate difference? I don't know, because I actually do agree with Dr. Johnson. She is brilliant. I had the opportunity of working with her on the sexual assault kit initiative. And so my guess is she knows her research pretty well. And until we have that consistency, right, because there's other repercussions besides jail time on someone who's convicted of DV. And again, as society continues to change culturally, just that conviction impacts their opportunities, right? Because when you look and see that somebody was convicted of assaulting their partner, that should make you extrapolate other assumptions about the type of person they are, right? So it might impact job prospects, it might impact custody issues later, things like that. So there are other consequences that I do feel the certainty of and the forced treatment of, right? We see it with substance use court and mental health court. And the reality is that DOC is our largest mental health and substance use provider in the state, by and large, right? And unfortunately, sometimes that's the only mechanism to get people help. The issue with domestic violence, though, is there's so little data-driven and supported methods of intervention, because behaviors that took you 30 years to learn, you're not going to unlearn in a 20-week course, right? What we often find is that it actually just teaches them to be better batterers and to get away with it better.
Something you hear a lot about is that a man who has a substance abuse issue or alcohol issue, that if he gets sober, is much less likely to continue the abusive behavior. Would you say that's true?
I would say it varies on relationship, but overwhelmingly, I would say that's probably inaccurate. And I say this after working with probably thousands of victims at this point, is when you talk to them about the relationship and in the dynamics that they're experiencing, what you typically see is that those abusive behaviors are present when they are sober. Well, they tend to escalate when they are intoxicated. And so whereas when they're sober, it might be controlling who they're allowed to hang out with. It might be controlling the money. It might be blocking them physically in doorways or punching walls. When they're intoxicated, escalates up to strangulation or a punch in the face. And so in victims' experiences, the lesser isn't abusive. That's not what they're afraid of, right? They're afraid of the alcohol coming into play or the drugs coming into play, and then it escalating to the point of strangulation. So even when you're talking to victims, they have a hard time discerning that full continuum of abusive behaviors. And so I would say, yes, substance use treatment is important, but it should be substance use treatment right? And unless the accountability for the behaviors that go in across the full, gamut of sobriety are addressed, it's not going to impact it. It's still going to be unhealthy. It's still going to be abusive.
In your years of working in this space, can you talk a little bit about abusers who have taken responsibility for their behavior and changed it?
I am probably the not the best person to talk to that. I have seen it. Right?
It's possible.
It's possible. I think it is so individual because you're asking a person to incorporate a label into their identity that hurts, right? Like that is very hard. And so from like a human aspect, I have compassion even for that, right? That accepting that is who you are or a part of who you are.
Or who you were.
Or who you were is very, very difficult. And I have talked to males who have completed treatment and who have stopped physical abusive behaviors. And I am always surprised because when you listen to them, what you still hear is blame. It's like, yes, I did these things, but it's not like it was out of nowhere. It's not like it was, I didn't break bones. I didn't do these things. And that's just cognitive dissonance, right? We do that as human beings with everything, right? It's the fox and the grapes. In order to heal emotionally, you have to minimize those things.
So I'm going to go to a very controversial place, and I may not have the courage to leave it in, but Mary J. Blige gave an interview to 60 Minutes probably 2 decades ago. And it's obviously stuck in my head to this day. She had been in a couple of very abusive relationships, and she left them. She got herself out, but then she was in a relationship with a man who'd never been abusive before, and it became an abusive relationship. She felt that in some way that she was doing something that was leading to the violence.
Here is a short excerpt of Mary J. Blige being interviewed by Ed Bradley on 60 Minutes in 2003.
So men you went out with physically abused you?
Yeah. And I don't blame them because I allowed it.
But how can you not blame them? They beat you. That's not your fault.
It's not my fault, but the only way that I could get out is to stop being a victim. I had to stop saying, you did it. You. It's because of you. I had to sit down and say, you know what? Something is wrong here because every man that I get is doing the same exact thing to me. So maybe it's something wrong with me.
And I don't know, is that, was she being completely off the wall? Is that like something
It is something that I hear frequently with survivors. The self-blame is a very, very common reaction. And the reality is relationships and the dynamics between human beings is complicated, and then intimate ones are complicated. And so there is always going to be instances where people are not bringing their best selves to situations and things get escalated. I can tell you, I have heard numerous stories where women in abusive relationships say flat out, I instigated the situation to the point it exploded because then I can control when and where it happened. And we would see that, especially take an example with children. We have victims that say, I will antagonize and escalate for that assault to come while the kids are at school because I feel it's coming. And I would rather get that explosion out of the way when the kids are not home than for me to walk on eggshells and feel it keep building up to the point of that explosion.
That it's happening at night when the kids are home.
Yep, or wherever. And that is very typical. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm saying that is one of the dynamics that we're dealing with. And that's one of the dynamics the law enforcement responds to. And they're trying to sort out this situation.
There's also a stereotype, right or wrong, that when law enforcement shows up, that the often male law enforcement officer is more likely to give the benefit of the doubt to the male perpetrator and say this is a man and woman, having a typical fight. And that sometimes, just by the nature of the demographics of who is the police officer, that there might be more likelihood to give slack to the perpetrator of domestic violence.
I would say that if this was the 60s, 70s, or 80s, absolutely. I do think law enforcement has so much more training and understanding that that's not as blanket of an assumption I would make. I would say that it is more based on the behaviors of the individuals when they're walking into the situation. And again, giving law enforcement a little bit of the benefit of the doubt because these situations are messy. I've gone on a lot of ride-alongs, and even with the knowledge I have, and I walk in and I'm like, ooh, who do you believe, right? It's this story versus this story and all of those things. But again, to stereotype a little bit and to generalize, what we have seen when law enforcement responds is certain types of behaviors that are going to end up eliciting certain responses. So what you typically have is again, generalizing to the upteenth, right? A male perpetrator who knows what they did and is very calm. And it's like, yes, sir, officer, sir, here's what happened. And she is going nuts. She is accusing me of cheating. She is wanting to look through my phone and do all of these things. And look at her. She's insane. And you have a woman who just got assaulted, screaming, right? Crying, cussing at the officer, right? All of those things. And so just from a human standpoint, you're going to be like, okay, this person seems like they're able to tell me a coherent story, right? Seems super legit. I believe him. And so those dynamics often will come into play too. And that's one of the things we would try to train officers to be prepared for is there is absolutely going to be manipulation of you in that scenario, because what you see is perpetrators of domestic violence have done this for many, many, many years and often have zero arrest records. So that tells you they're able to target their behavior in certain ways. They're not punching out their boss. They're not punching out their kid's teacher, right? They are targeting violence. And then from everybody else around them, they will say,
He's a good guy.
he's such a good guy, right?
Yeah, and I think that's so scary because then law enforcement leaves. And then he's like, what are you going to do now?
Absolutely. And you have victims, right, that are also putting up barriers to a thorough investigation because, again, the odds are not in their favor. So if that person is arrested and then they're released in 12 hours and they end up serving 0 jail time and having ultimately very little consequence, but it just increased their likelihood dramatically of being murdered, what would be the expectation? It's they're going to lie to law enforcement. They are going to minimize and or
To
take
protect
blame.
themselves and their children.
Exactly.
Let's
It's
talk about
com-
domestic violence protective orders. So we had Laura Booch on the podcast in a few months ago. She testified in House Judiciary about her situation, which is that she was the victim of domestic violence, had children, got herself eventually out of that relationship. And she has to reapply for a domestic violence protective order every year.
Yep.
And she talked about the trauma of having to face her abuser in court every year. And also acknowledging that from her perspective, she's never going to not want that protective order.
Yep.
There's never going to be a day when she feels safe. And there are many states that offer a longer protective order. Some even offer an indefinite protective order. Can you speak to the need for that?
I completely get it from a survivor's perspective. There is nothing about our criminal justice system that is set up for them, right? It was literally developed to protect the rights of the accused. And so every situation is going to increase trauma, likely, right? It's going to feel like a re-victimization. And it also speaks to the fact that we, again, still don't fully not understand the dynamics, but accept them as truth, right? That 5 years from now, why would that person care anymore? They've been separated for 5 years. When the reality is those dynamics, especially when there's children involved, really don't stop. They evolve, but they don't stop.
And I think the children part is really important because I think I'll use Brenda Stanfill, who was on the show recently. She talked about not wanting her kids to hate their father. And, and so having that dynamic there of wanting kids to be able, if they chose to have a relationship with their father, I mean, what a difficult tightrope walk.
Yep, absolutely. And that's many of the survivors we work with. That's what you'll hear is they're abusive, but they're a good father. And it's hard to balance that with a good father doesn't beat the mother of their children, right? They don't cause lifelong trauma by their children being exposed to those things. And then on the other side, we also know in 40 to 60% of domestic violence cases, there is also child abuse. And I'm not advocating for fathers to lose visitation or anything like that. What I'm saying is it's complicated and every case is different. And you have many women who are also being put in the position of, I stay with him and I know my children are as safe as possible because I'm taking steps to ensure they're safe. If we are separated and he has visitation, I am not there to protect them. And what you will see is when the abuse can't be directed towards the original victim is you do end up seeing some instances of child abuse post-separation because now that's the direction.
Well, and Brenda talked about thinking that the abuse all occurred out of earshot of the children. But she said, once her daughter was an adult, her daughter told her, of course I knew. Of course we knew what was happening.
Yeah. And I think that's part of that cognitive dissonance we were talking about on the batterer side too, right? Is victims are already experiencing so much shame, especially when it comes to the pain of their children. And they have taken very real steps to mitigate and minimize it to the best of their ability. And that's the only way emotionally during that period, you're not going to completely break, My mom felt the same way. It's like she tried to manage it. We all knew. And whether we were present during the assaults and heard it or saw it, we saw the aftermath, right? And many survivors' children see the aftermath. They see the holes in the wall and the bruises on their parent. They see the changes in the behavior. They are taught, again, without words, to walk on the eggshells to manage the emotions and moods of this other person, right? Like it's part of everybody's everyday life in those households.
Let's talk about AWAIC. So you are the executive director.
I am.
For folks out there who may not know what the organization is, what is the organization and what services does it provide?
Yes. So AWAIC, or Abused Women's Aid in Crisis, is a full continuum of domestic violence services. So we do everything from emergency shelter, which is what people typically think of us, right? We do everything from emergency shelter to case management and transitional housing options, legal advocacy, and full breadth of non-residential services. That's one of the biggest messages we've been trying to push out there is even if you do not want to come stay in a shelter or you don't need to, right? You can still participate in all of our other services and we can provide the same support and advocacy. Shelter is just one component. But our shelter is what most people know of, and that is a 67-bed shelter that we have on our campus. And we do a little bit opposite of what a lot of programs have done throughout the country, where it's like, we are not in a secret location. Our address is everywhere. Our phone number is everywhere. Perpetrators know where we are, and they come and show up in a parking lot with a semi-automatic rifle, right? They know that this is where somebody could be. We counteract that with the physical security of the building. You experienced when you came in, we have double locking doors, we have security cameras, we have fencing, we have all those things, and we have a very strong relationship with law enforcement. Because we don't have to call law enforcement very often, they know because of who we are, when we call, they get here very quickly. And so that's a little bit of that deterrent effect that, Dr. Johnson was even talking about, of absolute consequence, right? We have been very fortunate because of that relationship and because of the structure of our building to be able to provide that secure location for people.
Does the typical person who needs help, does that person show up at the door? Do they call first? How do folks get in?
Very good question. So all of those, right? We have people show up at our door every day, all hours of the night. We have people that first call our crisis line, and we also have a lot of direct referrals from partners in the community. So law enforcement is very aware of us. The mobile crisis team is very aware of us, and other kind of social services. And so we also get a lot of referrals, in even, law enforcement bringing somebody over.
Right. So like in a case where law enforcement is called to a home and they make the arrest, would they then suggest that she go to AWAIC?
They usually bring it up as an option, absolutely. And so I would say I can't think of an Anchorage police officer who is not aware of our services, and they present that as an option. They're also legally obligated to go over a series of resources with victims of domestic violence, and so it naturally segues into them informing them that we're here.
If a woman shows up with school-aged children, they all get to stay here?
Yep.
And do they go to their home school? I mean, how do they get to school?
No, that's a great question too. So we have a partnership with the school district that we allow the mom to make the decision on what is safest for her kids. If she feels it is safe enough for them to remain at their home school, then we coordinate with the Anchorage School District to have specialized transportation to make sure that they can maintain that connection. And that's best case scenario. If it is not safe for them to remain at their home school, then we strategize around where is going to be the safest place, and the Anchorage School District will help facilitate a transfer.
And we did a tour. I heard a dog in someone's room.
Yes.
So pets are allowed, or how does that work?
Service animals are allowed. And one day I would love us to have a structure in our facility where we could have pets on site. But in the meantime, we have a partnership with a local rescue to help us run our Safe Haven program. And so any person that comes to us that has a pet would be eligible for their pet to be in temporary foster care through this partner. So they know that their pet is safe. And then once they get to a point of transitioning out, whether it's to housing, whether it's back to family or whatever, then they still have ownership of their pet that was well cared for, and they can take them on to their next step.
And there are caseworkers here who meet with the individual to help them in terms of finding their own apartment, to getting themselves out of shelter and safe from their abuser.
Yes. So we have case managers that do full kind of case planning with survivors. We're a little bit different than some programs where with those case plans being completely survivor directed. So that might mean if housing is not their priority and, mental health support is, or getting their children different services is their number one priority, that might dictate a lot of their focus. So it's 100% survivor focused, but we do have specific programs and laws in place that if they are a domestic violence survivor, then we can get them onto the pathway for certain things like housing.
Let me explore that a little bit. So let's say survivor directed, she wants mental health support because she believes that with the right mental health support, she can return to her home where the abuser is?
No, not necessarily.
Okay. That's what I heard.
Well, no. Oh, well, and thank you for clarifying, because it brings up a separate point that part of the hard work that we do is having to accept that one of the dynamics that we deal with domestic violence is that many survivors will return home, and sometimes multiple times. And so what research shows us is that it's an average of 7 to 10 times that a survivor might try to exit that relationship before they finally break away, because there, again, are many other complicating factors. And the simplest being that often they still love the person. They don't want the relationship to end. They want the abuse to stop, which is very different. And so sometimes they will return home, and we maintain an open door. We're not going to place judgment. We will obviously go over pros and cons and safety planning, and we would prefer someone not return home to an abusive place. But we would also rather them feel comfortable enough coming back to us again when they need us again. So the directed piece might be someone recognizing that until I have mental health supports, or until I address X, Y, and Z issues, I'm not going to be able to maintain stable housing. So Whereas we want to move people along and get them set up. We also want it to be sustainable for them. And someone might not be ready for their own housing for 3, 6, 9, 12 months because there's so much other healing that they need to do before they're isolated back in an apartment by themselves.
I'm sure it's not a completely off the wall thing to say that you might have folks come in who have been in an abusive relationship for a very long time and have never held a job.
Absolutely.
Do you provide help with finding employment for somebody who maybe doesn't have the best resume?
Yes. We end up working with a lot of survivors that have very spotty work history or absence of work history, along with very spotty rental history and evictions, sometimes their own criminal convictions. It's really the gamut. Having a resume that jumps around is actually very typical for a domestic violence survivor because that sabotage of employment is a very standard method of power and control within domestic violence relationships. And so we work with survivors to create, more functional resumes where it's focusing on functional skills rather than listing all their employment places. And also even coming up with their kind of elevator pitch of why they have gaps of employment. But the reality is women have been dealing with that from the dawn of time, whether they're domestic violence victims or not, because we have to explain as moms most of the time why we have gaps in our employment, or why we haven't held a job because we were raising children. And so it's honestly just another area where we're already resilient because that's part of how we have to be.
Last question. We've been speaking exclusively about women who've experienced domestic violence because generally that is the vast majority. But if a man were a victim of domestic violence, where could that person get
Great question.
resources?
And that's where our name creates a little bit of confusion because we actually serve all victims of domestic violence, all genders. And so here on site, we serve female and female identifying survivors because that was how our building was designed and constructed. If we have a male or male identifying survivor, then we have other partnerships with other programs. If they are a parenting survivor, then we have a direct referral pathway to McKinnell House where they can provide the shelter component, and then we provide all the other services that we would for any survivor. We also...
What's the parenting?
Because McKinnell House serves 2-parent households or single fathers,
Got it.
They have to have a child in their care.
Got it. So if a man shows up with a child.
Yes. If it is a single male, then we will kind of assess what the lethality is. And it might mean that they have to stay in a congregate shelter while receiving DV-specific services. But if there's a concern around danger and lethality, we have funds that might be able to support them, in hotel stays or relocation. What we typically see with male victims, and it's not to minimize the abuse that they've experienced, is they tend to experience abuse, but generally not have a lot of lethality associated. And that means once they depart from the relationship, their safety increases, whereas with females, when they depart from the relationship, their safety decreases.
And I guess, do you have a message for anyone out there who might be experiencing abuse, who's listened to this and thinks that maybe they need help?
It would be that we are here, and it can start small, right? It can start with just a phone call if you want to talk through your situation. It might be that you can show up at 2 a.m., whether it's for a conversation or whether you need immediate safety. I would say my message would also go to supporters and loved ones, because domestic violence tends to be very isolating as one of the dynamics. I would strongly encourage that family, friends, and loved ones don't perpetuate that isolation that the abuser is trying to create through ultimatums and conditional relationships. Obviously,
Tough love. Like saying,
Yeah.
like, if she's not going to get out, I'm done.
Yep. And I'm not saying don't keep themselves safe, right? Because there is some safety aspects. But what you will see is that kind of aspect of, look, I can't be friends with you while you're with him. So until you break it off, we have to stop. Because that's exactly what the abuser wants and is trying to create. We will often see survivors that can reconnect with their loved ones once they leave because they could not maintain that relationship when they were together. So that's just something from a supporter standpoint, I would say, is like, just know that's one of the dynamics. And if you can safely maintain that open door and that open pathway, that could quite literally be life-saving for somebody.
And you said that you thought about some books. We've mentioned a couple. Do you have another book to recommend?
So Gift of Fear. The other one I love is Why Does He Do That by Lindy Bancroft. There's so many good books out there. There's so many powerful stories, but those are great foundational books that I feel like everybody should read just for a little bit of understanding.
Well, Randi Breager, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Yeah, no, thank you.
In the show notes, you will find a link to AWAIC's website. Remember, if you or someone you know is the victim of abuse in the home, please call 907-272-0100. You will also find links in the show notes to the New Yorker profile of Andrew and Tristan Tate, the 60 Minutes interview with Mary J. Blige, and the East Anchorage Book Club podcast episodes mentioned today. Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@akleg.gov or call 907-269-0123.